Welcome back to the Answer Series Diagnostic Report Teaching and Learning Tool for the NSC November examination, an all-in-one tool that combines the paper, memorandum, and annual diagnostic report commentary to create a comprehensive teaching and learning experience. TAS provides this document for free, and we encourage teachers, learners, tutors, and subject advisors to use it. All we ask is that you please give credit where credit is due and not change or alter any content in this document that removes our name from it. Next, the teaching tool dives into the actual paper, starting with the multiple choice section. First, you will have a slide that only displays the questions, answer options, and page references from our TAS books. Then, the next page will have the answers in red circles. So let's work through them together. The hormone responsible for the regulation of salt content in the human body is B, aldosterone. 1.1.2, which one of the following is a stage in human embryonic development? The choroid is something in the eye. The amnion and chorion are structures in the uterus as part of the fetus's development, but it's not an actual stage in human embryonic development. So through process of elimination, the answer there is C, morula. Question 113, when the carbon dioxide level in the blood increases above normal, just reading that statement tells you that this is something typical of what happens during exercise. So your carbon dioxide levels go up, the blood is going to become a little bit more acidic, and the body responds in a homeostatic way by having to exhale more of that carbon dioxide. So considering that, let's look at the options provided. The rate and depth of breathing decreases definitely makes no sense, because that would mean that carbon dioxide starts to increase even more. Receptor cells in the diaphragm are stimulated. The diaphragm does not have receptor cells for pH. The heartbeat definitely does not need to go slower in this circumstance. We need to pump more blood to get the carbon dioxide out. So the only potential answer there is then D. Receptor cells in the carotid artery in the neck are stimulated. And that definitely sounds more familiar and correct in the context. Question 4, which one of the following changes occurs under the influence of adrenaline? Adrenaline is always the fight or flight response. So let's see, A is the answer, an increased blood supply to the skeletal muscles, which will obviously provide them with more energy to run away from whatever is chasing you. B, a decrease in blood pressure. In certain parts of the body, yes, but generally speaking, adrenaline increases blood pressure because you want that heart to pump more blood to get to the organs that need to make you run. Then C, a decreased muscle tone in skeletal muscles will also not be correct. In fact, the opposite happens when adrenaline is released, because you increase muscle tone because you're running away from the lion. And then D, an increased blood supply to the digestive system. Being able to digest your lunch is not going to be a priority in a fight or flight situation, so that's definitely not an option to consider. Question 115. A girl is barefoot and steps onto a thorn, causing a reflex action. Which one of the following represents the correct pathway of a reflex arc? So, immediately B and C fall away as options because the muscle is the last thing to respond in a reflex arc. That leaves us with A and D, both starting with a pain receptor. So now we just need to see what the sequence of the neurons is. That's the only difference. So first you have your sensory neuron that's connected to the receptor, picking up on the stimulus, and then a motor neuron makes your body move in some way, or a gland responds in some way. So D is the correct option here, where you have a pain receptor, then a sensory neuron, then the motor neuron, and lastly, the leg muscle. So commentary from the diagnostic report says that candidates did not read or follow the instructions as stated in the questions. They were giving more than one option to multiple choice questions when there's only one correct one. And importantly, markers are instructed in such circumstances to only mark the first answer given. So always follow the instructions of the question. Question 116 to 118, let's have a look at those answers. So the diagram represents a part of the human eye. A spectator in a soccer stadium is seated 200 meters away from the field. So you can already feel something about lens accommodation coming in here, hey? Which one of the following describes the condition of structures X, Y, and Z when he looks at the ball placed in the middle of the field? So this would be a classic example of looking far away, right, where accommodation of the eye is not necessary. The eye is going to be in a relaxed state. So understanding the diagram, X is showing you the ciliary muscles, Y is showing the suspensory ligaments, and Z is showing the lens itself. So if you're looking far away and the eye is in a relaxed state, the options A and C are the only ones that you really need to consider, because the muscle in X needs to be relaxed. Then in terms of what happens to the lens, Z, if you're looking far away, the lens is usually much flatter because there's not a lot of refraction required. So looking at Z, there's going to be a less convex lens, which means the correct option is C. Then question 7, which one of the following is involved in thermoregulation? The corpus callosum is a structure in the brain that connects the two halves, so it's definitely not that one. The cerebellum is the ballerina, and it's responsible for balance coordination, nothing to do with thermoregulation. And the spinal cord is a very big structure that has also got nothing to do with thermoregulation. So the only real option there, if you did not recognize it initially, is hypothalamus B. Question 8, the following is a list of factors regarding a developing fetus: temperature regulation, protection, free movement, and nutrition. For which combination of factors is the amniotic fluid responsible? So from learning work, the fluid is responsible for temperature regulation. It does protect the fetus against shocks. It does allow free movement, as it is a liquid in which the fetus can float around in, but it definitely is not responsible for nutrition. That is the function of the placenta and the blood supply. So the only options that apply is number 1, 2, and 3, and therefore the correct answer is A. Then the last two questions, number 9 and number 10. Question 119, the diagram below shows a part of the human ear. Which one of the following occurs when there are excess waves in the inner ear? Now that sentence itself can easily help you determine which is the correct answer, because the excess waves here are specifically referred to in the inner ear. And if we look at the diagram, A and C are structures that are not even connected to the inner ear. A is the tympanum, it's the barrier between the outer ear and the middle ear, which is shown in this diagram, and C is the eustachian tube, which is connecting the middle ear to the pharynx and allowing for an equalization of air pressure between the middle and outer ear. So technically the only structure that's really connected to the inner ear that has a label in this diagram is actually B, which is the round window. And that's actually its function. It's to absorb excess pressure waves in the inner ear. So the correct option here is C, pressure is absorbed at B. And then the last question, number 10, the diagram below represents the transmission of impulses from a structure in the inner ear to the brain. And the nerve impulses for balance are transmitted as follows. Learners had to look at the pathways represented by letters and choose the correct sequence. And the diagnostic report says that candidates were not familiar with the pathway of the nerve impulses for balance. So let's revise this. So we start with an overview of this diagram showing all the pathways of nerve impulses from the ear to the brain. And this is quite important that learners actually can visualize this. Maybe you want to draw something similar for the eye. We do learn about the brain in its entirety as one part. We also learn about the ear in its entirety in one part. And we don't often connect these two visually. So this is very important. So our A-man says, let's label this diagram to understand the pathways for impulses from the ear to the different parts of the brain. So on this side of the diagram, we have the ear. And on the other side, we have the brain in all of its glory. The black lines in between connect the two, and they therefore represent the nerve pathways between these two structures. Now remember that the ear is responsible for detecting two types of stimuli, sound and balance or coordination. So let's look at the pathway for balance and coordination first, and that is the red pathway on this diagram. The receptors for balance and coordination are located in this structure called the vestibular apparatus. Inside it, there are two receptors. The first receptors are located in the utriculus and sacculus. They are the maculae, and they detect the position of the head in respect to gravity. Then number 2 on the diagram indicates the receptors inside the ampullae of the semicircular canals, and they are responsible for detecting movement of the head, its speed and direction in the different horizontal planes. So the answer to 2 is that these receptors are actually called cristae, Both of these receptors respond to their respective stimuli in the ear, and then they generate nerve impulses that travel through number 3, the vestibular nerve. That vestibular nerve runs together with the other nerve that creates the blue pathway to form the auditory nerve, the nerve that runs from the auditory area, the auditory sense organ, namely the ear. And that conducts impulses towards the part of the brain that controls balance and coordination. Remember the ballerina? So part number 5 is responsible for interpreting movement and position of the head in space, the cerebellum. And that completes the pathway for the red arrow, which is number 6 from the vestibular apparatus. So the vestibular apparatus collects stimuli regarding balance and coordination in the ear, and then it conducts it via this nerve pathway in red towards the cerebellum in the brain. Next up, let's look at the blue pathway that is responsible for collecting sound stimuli. We start with sound waves traveling down the outer ear canal towards the tympanum. Then it goes through the ossicles in the middle ear and hits the oval window. This creates pressure waves within the structure called the cochlea, this little snail-like structure. And inside of the cochlea, there are tiny hair cell receptors called the organ of Corti. Those are the receptors for sound. The nerve impulses generated by the organ of Corti receptors are then transmitted through number 8, the cochlear nerve. It comes from the cochlea, so it's the cochlear nerve. This runs together with the vestibular nerve to form the auditory nerve and transmits the nerve impulses to the part of the brain that interprets sound, which is the cerebrum. Detail about the different lobes are not important for NSC examinations, so learners really just need to know that the cerebrum is responsible for interpreting sound. So lastly, the blue pathways, number 10, can be completed that nerve impulses for sound come from the cochlea. And there's the entire pathway between the ears and the brain, which would make a nice summary page for you to print out or work through with your learners. Then returning home, we will continue with question 1.2.1 to 1.2.8, which is the biological terminology. If we look at the answers, you'll see that a lot of the highlighted questions, which are the ones that the diagnostic report identified as being problematic, reiterate the commonly confused terms that we listed at the beginning. So question 1.2.1, the structure that connects the fetus to the placenta is the umbilical cord. Very often learners wrote umbilical vein or umbilical artery instead of the entire structure and not a specific blood vessel. So the cord contains the vein and the artery. Those are not responsible for connecting the fetus to the placenta. Question 1.2.2, the part of the nervous system that consists of sympathetic and parasympathetic sections is the autonomic nervous system. Note that the mark was provided for autonomic as the phrase nervous system already appears within the question, and that's very typical of marking guidelines. Now learners lost marks here because they either gave the incorrect nervous system, they wrote peripheral nervous system, or they gave an unaccredited abbreviation, ANS, instead of writing out autonomic nervous system. So it's important that we also teach full words and not abbreviations when they're not accredited. Question 1.2.3, receptors in the ear that detect changes in speed and direction of movement of the head. Those are the cristae. Learners often provided a maculae, so they confused the function of the two receptors. Question 1.2.4, the ossicle that transfers vibrations to the oval window is the stirrup, or the stapes was also accepted, and this is where learners wanted to write stirrup but instead spelled syrup, and we were all wondering where the waffles were. Question 1.2.5, the growth reaction of a plant in response to gravity is called geotropism. Also, gravitropism was accepted. So it's the growth reaction, the entire reaction to gravity geotropism. Learners either provided positive or negative geotropism. Question 1.2.6, the part in the ear where the organ of Corti is located is the cochlea. 1.2.7, a plant hormone that stimulates the germination of seeds is gibberellins for germination. And question 1.2.8, a structure in the head of a sperm cell that contains enzymes is the acrosome. In question 1.3, learners had to determine which options A and B or none applied to each statement. Question 131 acts as a microfilter for the developing fetus, either the placenta or the cervix. The correct answer there was only A, as the cervix is not even part of the whole fetal setup. It is the opening between the uterus and the vagina, so the placenta is the only logical option there. Question 132, the part of the brain that controls the heart rate. You have the corpus callosum and the medulla oblongata as options. Corpus callosum is this white fibrous structure that connects the two hemispheres. It has nothing to do with controlling the heart rate. So again, only B there as a logical option is the medulla oblongata. And question 133, the area on the retina where there are no rods or cones is very appropriately called the blind spot, because without rods and cones, you can't really see. So the blind spot, only A. Then question 1.4, the diagram represents the front view of the human male reproductive system. So let's look at the diagnostic report, commentary, and memo. Question 1.4.1 was a bit of an issue. It says, give the letter and name of the structure that forms part of both the urinary and reproductive systems. The options learners could have provided is C, urethra, or D, penis. Question B says that stores sperm temporarily. That is obviously the epididymis. We talked about this during the general comments section. So the letter there is B. And lastly, secretes testosterone is a function of the testes, E. Now, the reason this was a problematic question is because candidates provided only the letter or only the name instead of both. So they were not reading, and you can see that each question counted 2 marks because you got a separate mark for the letter and a separate mark for the name. In question A, candidates could not spell urethra. Many of them wrote ureter instead, which is not the correct tube we're looking for. And in B, where candidates had to give the structure that stores sperm temporarily, they couldn't differentiate between the epididymis and the vas deferens. So many of them actually giving the incorrect name in that scenario. Question 1.4.2, identify part A. A is the prostate gland, situated nice and snugly under the bladder. And then question B, the type of gametogenesis that takes place in part E is spermatogenesis. Then the last question for section A was concerned with homeostasis. The diagram represents some structures involved in homeostasis in the human body. Question 1.5.1 asks to write the letters of the parts that serve as endocrine glands only. So we're going to look at all the structures here that are endocrine glands, meaning they release their hormones directly into the blood. And that includes A and F only because those contain only endocrine glands. C is a sweat gland, which is an exocrine gland, and D is the pancreas, which was there to trip learners up because, yes, the pancreas does have an endocrine gland component, but it also has an exocrine gland component. So candidates could not differentiate between exocrine and endocrine glands. Question 1.5.2, give the letters and names, right, both things, of the parts responsible for the regulation of body temperature. So if we look at the diagnostic report commentary, it says that candidates had difficulty linking both the sweat glands and the blood vessels to thermoregulation. They also incorrectly identified the hypothalamus, which is not one of the structures actually given a letter in the picture. A, if you were wondering, is the pituitary gland. So that's not indicating the hypothalamus. So the correct letters and names here were the capillaries, B, or you could have said blood vessels, and C, the sweat gland. So let's just briefly revise this as well. So let's recap thermoregulation using these extracts from the Answer Series Grade 12 Life Sciences Part 1 Class Text and Study Guide, pages 86 and 87. On a warm day, we're going to see that those temperatures stimulate the Ruffini corpuscles in the skin. You can also just say the receptors for heat in the skin. You do not need to know their specific names. That is going to cause nerve impulses to be generated, and they're transmitted from the skin to the heat regulation center in the hypothalamus, which is situated just above the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus will then cause nerve impulses to be transmitted 2 blood vessels in the skin, and it causes vasodilation, the widening of skin capillaries. Less blood will then flow towards deeper layers of the skin, and more blood is going to flow towards the surface of the skin, which leads to more heat being lost through convection, radiation, and conduction. Another thing that happens is that an increased blood supply to the surface of the skin will also make sweat glands more active. So they're going to produce more sweat, and as sweat evaporates, it cools the surface of the skin, leading to heat loss. So the structures that are involved in thermoregulation on a warm day are the hypothalamus, the blood vessels, and the sweat glands. The converse happens on a cold day. Krauss corpuscles in the skin detect the drop in temperature. Again, you just need to remember cold sensors or cold receptors in the skin detects this drop in environmental temperature, which then stimulates the production of nerve impulses, and they run towards the hypothalamus, where you have your thermoregulatory center. The hypothalamus then communicates via nerve impulses with the blood vessels in the skin, causing vasoconstriction. We want to constrict them to conserve as much heat in the body as possible. So the narrowing of the skin capillaries means that more blood will flow towards deeper layers of the skin, but less blood is going to flow towards the surface of the skin. So less heat is lost through radiation, convection, and conduction, and having less blood flowing towards the surface of the skin means that your sweat glands will also be less active. So less sweat is produced, less sweat evaporates, and less cooling of the body surface occurs, allowing you to heat up a little bit. Then continuing to question 1.5.3, it says name the following with regards to the regulation of water content in the blood. The hormone that is secreted by part A, that is the pituitary gland, the only hormone it secretes even remotely involved in water regulation is ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. And then target organ E is a kidney. So you just needed to name the part that was involved in the question. However, the diagnostic report says that candidates had difficulty identifying the hormone and the target organ for water regulation. They incorrectly referred to the renal tubules and cortex, which are not organs, nor are they actually shown in the diagram. General suggestions for improvement in Section A, as stated in the diagnostic report, says that paper 1 is about human physiology. So as we're teaching it, diagrams of different structures and organs are really an integral part of this paper. So they're best taught using annotated diagrams, of which there are a number in this section that you can print out for your learners. Give learners diagrams without labels and have them actually put in the labels and functions themselves, which is what we did with that whole pathway exercise between the ear and the brain. That's a good example of a diagram without labels that then ultimately serves as a learning resource. Only supply one answer to multiple choice questions, to terminology questions and items and statement questions, because if you are wasting the ink in your pen by writing a whole paragraph, a marker will only mark the first word because that was the instruction for the question. Biological terminology can only be mastered through practice after each section. Life sciences is a language and you need to be able to speak it. So you have to have a list, a glossary of terms of some kind, which we do include in the answer series rapid fire section, that makes a perfect study aid to master terminology. When a biological term is asked in question 1.2, and this is specific to question 1.2, you have to avoid abbreviations and acronyms, even if it's an accredited abbreviation. It's very important that you write out the whole word because the question asks you for a biological term, not a biological abbreviation. So be wary of abbreviations in general, but especially when it comes to question 1.2. Accredited abbreviations include the following: FSH, LH, TSH, ADH, N, which is the abbreviation for haploid, 2N, which is the abbreviation for diploid, DNA, RNA, mRNA, tRNA, rRNA, ER for endoplasmic reticulum, RER for rough endoplasmic reticulum, GM for genetic modification, and mtDNA for mitochondrial DNA. But again, preferably be able to write out the whole word for question 1.2, asking specifically about biological terminology.
If you found this video useful, give it a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new episodes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook to stay on top of the latest TAS news and launches. So that's it for now from the Answer Series, your key to exam success.